Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in West Virginia mines. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The winter of 1894 came early to the Appalachian ridges that hung over the Elk Valley. The timber roads iced over before the last of the coal wagons made it out, and the company towns huddled in silence under drifts of soot, black snow. Among them stood a small, nearly forgotten camp known as Blackstone Hollow, a settlement no larger than 30 families, built at the edge of a narrow shaft mouth that the locals swore was cursed even before the first timber brace was sunk. Records from the Kanawha County Clerk's office list the lease under one Mr. Thomas Blackstone, an English immigrant who had arrived from Nottinghamshire in 1872. He brought with him his wife Clara and 2 sons. In the early years, the mine was small, mostly surface work, but by 1888, when the deeper vein was found, the Blackstones had grown wealthy enough to purchase the land outright. That was when the men in town began to speak of the family who mined beneath their own dead. A faded ledger from the Charleston Gazette archives includes an article dated May 12, 1890, noting that the Blackstone family had built their home directly above an abandoned burial pit, one used decades earlier during a cholera outbreak. "They say the ground still sighs at night," wrote the unnamed correspondent. Few took it seriously then. West Virginia was full of graves, marked and unmarked alike. The miners who worked under Thomas Blackstone described him as stern but fair. He kept strict accounts, paid his men on time, and never tolerated drinking on the job. Yet there was something peculiar about the mine itself. It was said to breathe, literally exhale, warm gusts of air that carried the smell of iron and sulfur, even when the wind above was cold and still. By the summer of 1893, several men had refused to enter the lower galleries altogether, complaining of the whispers that followed the picks. One man, Elias Corder, a mule driver, later testified in a sworn statement that he heard the counting voice, a voice that spoke in rhythm with the hammer strikes, always counting upward but never reaching 10. His statement, found among the State Mining Bureau records of 1895, was dismissed as delirium from gas exposure. Still, the Blackstone mine was profitable, and coal wagons left daily for Charleston. That is, until December 2, 1894, the day 30 men went down the shaft and never came back up. What little could be recovered from the scene was confusing from the start. No explosion, no collapse, just silence. Rescue parties found the entry shaft perfectly intact, but the air was heavy, damp, and oddly cold. The lamps guttered within seconds of being lit. And at the bottom, where the main tunnel should have stretched straight east, there was only solid rock, as though the passage had never existed. When investigators from Charleston arrived days later, they found Thomas Blackstone pacing near the shaft, his hands raw from digging. His wife sat on the porch, staring into the snow. "They're not gone," she told a reporter. "They're just deeper than they were meant to go." In the official mining reports of that year, no catastrophe is listed for Blackstone Hollow. The site simply disappears from records after 1895. But decades later, when the Monongah disaster struck, an old miner claimed he recognized the same smell in the air, the same bitter, a metallic wind that had once rolled out of the Blackstone shaft before it sealed itself forever. The weeks that followed the disappearance of the 30 miners were marked by confusion and unease across Kanawha County. By December 10th, word had reached as far as Beckley, yet the story never appeared in most regional newspapers beyond a short note about missing workmen presumed dead. The Blackstone mine, after all, was not owned by any major company. It was family-run, self-insured, and isolated. No stockholders demanded answers, only widows. The first formal inquest was convened on December 14, 1894, in a drafty wooden courthouse in Charleston. Witnesses included surviving surface laborers, clerks, and 2 men who had left the shaft only hours before the others vanished. Their names, John Pruitt and Malcolm Dyer, appear repeatedly in the handwritten minutes preserved in the State Archives building. Pruitt's testimony was brief, Will went down at first light. The air smelled foul, worse than normal. I heard Mr. Blackstone shout something, but the sound twisted down there, like it came from the walls instead of the man. We turned back after 10 minutes. When we climbed up, the rope trembled as if 30 men below were still pulling. The coroner, Dr. Hiram Yates, noted that all lamps brought up from the pit bore traces of moisture inside the glass, as though they had been doused under water. Yet the mine was dry. No seepage noted. Reads his margin note, followed by a single word: unnatural. Locals began to avoid the road leading to Blackstone Hollow. Even wagon drivers refused to haul supplies. The postman, a wary man named Eddie Tomlin, later told an interviewer in 1919 that the place gave him the feeling of walking through someone else's dream. He swore that letters left at the Blackstone house never stayed in the box. I'd drop one in, come back next morning, and it'd be on the step, opened, sometimes burned around the edges. Meanwhile, Thomas Blackstone himself withdrew entirely from public view. His only contact with the outside world was through telegrams sent to a Professor Alan Devery, a mining engineer from Wheeling who had once surveyed the region's fault lines. One telegram, preserved in the Devery papers at the West Virginia University archives, reads, "Need your expertise urgently. Shaft defies mapping. Veins shifted overnight. Walls breathe. Bring instruments." Professor Devery arrived on January 3, 1895. He described the site as eerily intact, though lifeless, and reported that the mine's lower galleries were completely inaccessible. His team attempted to open the east tunnel but struck unyielding stone only 20 feet in. The geological maps he drew that month show an impossible formation, solid rock appearing where hollow corridors had been recorded weeks prior. Devery's report ends abruptly. The mountain has changed its mind. Rumors spread through nearby towns that the miners had broken into an old cave system, perhaps one laced with deadly gases. Others claimed they'd opened a buried chamber from the Civil War era, filled with munitions that had collapsed. But there was no explosion, no residue, no sound. Just a silence that many said hummed faintly if you stood close to the mouth of the shaft. The Charleston Gazette printed a short editorial in February questioning why the Blackstone mine, though shuttered, was guarded nightly by 2 men with rifles. Neither would speak to reporters, and no official order of closure was ever filed. The mine, it seemed, had closed itself. By the thaw of 1895, snowmelt ran black from the hills. Farmers downstream claimed their wells tasted of metal, and animals refused to drink. Some said they saw thin columns of steam rise from the ground where the mine had once vented its air. The shape of it was like a man exhaling. In later decades, when historians compiled mining fatality statistics, the Blackstone Hollow incident appeared nowhere. Only oral accounts and 2 missing persons lists survived. Yet among old miners in Monongah and Fairmont, the name lingered, a whispered warning about tunnels that move in the dark and walls that can breathe back. By the spring of 1895, when the thaw gave way to green mist and damp soil, the Blackstone property stood deserted. The house, a 2-story structure of chestnut logs and dark stone, remained shuttered except for a single light that burned in the upper window most nights. Locals whispered that Thomas Blackstone still kept vigil, waiting for the sound of pickaxes from below. But no one could say for certain. His wife was never seen again after January. A letter preserved in the Kanawha County Post records, dated March 2, 1895, suggests that Mrs. Clara Blackstone may have been sent to stay with distant relatives in Ohio. Yet a second account. This one from a traveling preacher, Reverend Cole Winstead, who claimed to have visited the house that same month, contradicted it entirely. In his sermon notes, found decades later among church papers, Winstead wrote, "The woman of the house met me at the door. Her hands were black to the wrist, as if stained with soot or ink. She spoke little but asked if the dead might still hear the living if the earth between them is not yet settled." No record of her departure from the region exists after that entry. Meanwhile, Professor Devery submitted his final report to the State Mining Bureau in April 1895. He concluded, somewhat cautiously, that the collapse had been geological in nature, caused by a shifting fault or sudden compaction. Yet he admitted, in a private addendum later found among his papers, that the core samples taken from the Blackstone site contained traces of mineral not native to the Appalachian Basin. He labeled the sample No. 47B. Composition unknown. DeVry's correspondence shows he sought consultation with a chemist from Pittsburgh, who replied that the mineral contained an unusual ratio of carbon to iron, almost as though it had once been organic matter subjected to immense pressure. The letter ends with the words, "If your site was once a burial pit, I would advise sealing it permanently." That recommendation was never formally acted upon, but by late 1895 the shaft had indeed been sealed, though not by human hands. Visitors reported that the opening seemed to have filled itself in, stones collapsing inward with uncanny precision, leaving a smooth slope of gray dust. DeVry called it horn active geology, though performed with intent. In the nearby settlement of Hawk's Nest, miners passing through began to speak of the Blackstones in low tones, warning newcomers not to take work near the Elk Valley. One man, a Lithuanian immigrant named Anton Kulis, told a story that still circulates in fragments. He claimed to have been one of the 30, saved only because he overslept that morning. According to Kulis, there had been talk in the mine of finding something not meant to be found. The men, he said, broke through into a deep hollow lined with what looked like bones, but they were too big for men. When pressed, he swore he never spoke of it again, fearing deportation or madness. That same year, reports of illness began to spread through the valley. Sooty coughs that wouldn't heal, dizziness, and strange dreams of faces under glass. Dr. Yates noted an unusual consistency. Nearly all sufferers had drunk from the same stream that ran past the Blackstone property. Samples showed no toxins known to science at the time, only a faint luminescence under lamplight. By the end of 1896, Blackstone Hollow had become a forbidden subject in county records. Mail to the family was returned unopened, stamped, "Address unknown." Even maps redrawn in the next decade omitted the small spur road that once led there. It was as though the settlement had been quietly erased, a place that existed only in the memories of those who dared remember it. Years later, when investigators of the Monongah disaster interviewed surviving miners, one old man from Kanawha County remarked, "You don't dig where the mountain hums." That's what the Blackstones taught us. The interviewer crossed out the line before publication, but the warning remained in his notes, like a ghost pressed between pages. In the summer of 1897, nearly 3 years after the Blackstone incident, the mine was officially listed as abandoned property. The deed reverted to the state, though none of the inspectors sent to appraise the site reported staying more than an hour. One such man, Ephraim Lutz, later recounted in a private letter to his wife that his horse refused to cross the final bridge into the hollow. "The air thickened," he wrote, "not smoke. Something older, heavier, as if the hill itself were breathing down my neck." Still, the state required assessment. Lutz and a young surveyor named Harlan Poe approached on foot. What they found, according to Poe's field notes, was no longer a mine but a scar. The ground had sunk several feet across a 100-yard radius, leaving concentric rings of fractured shale. The old timber headframe had collapsed inward, and yet, oddly, there was no debris, just dust, fine as flour, covering everything. No birds, no insects, no trace of habitation. They marked the place as condemned and returned to Charleston. That was the last official mention of Blackstone Hollow in any government record until 1901. What drew attention again was not mining, but death. That spring, a group of children from a nearby hamlet called Elk Crossing were playing along the stream that wound past the old property. They discovered something half buried in the silt, a boot, still laced, the leather almost petrified. Inside was a foot, blackened, but perfectly preserved. The coroner identified it as belonging to a miner named Samuel Harker, one of the 30 listed missing since 1894. The finding reignited rumors long dormant, and for a brief time, the name Blackstone reappeared in headlines. The Charleston Daily Mail printed a short piece titled, "Relic of a Lost Crew." Reporters arrived. drawn by whispers that the mine might yet contain bodies, or worse, survivors. When a second search was proposed, no laborers volunteered. Only one man, Deputy Marshal Reuben Wade, agreed to oversee the effort, saying, "I'd rather drag up ghosts than leave them waiting." Wade and a team of convicts from the county jail began digging at the old shaft on May 4, 1901. Within hours, one prisoner fell ill, claiming to hear hammering beneath the dirt. Another collapsed entirely, bleeding from the nose. By nightfall, Wade halted the work. He filed a terse report stating, "Ground unstable, emits gas. Recommend sealing permanently." But those who read between the lines noted something else. Wade had scratched out a single sentence halfway down the page. "There is light below." Soon after, the county fenced off the hollow and posted warning signs. Locals began calling it the breathing pit. Travelers along the mountain road said they sometimes saw a dim red glow flickering in the valley on overcast nights. One newspaper compared it to the ghost furnaces of Monongah, referencing that growing mining region far to the north. Though no such industry remained here, that same year, a drifter named Isaac Reed was arrested in Charleston for public intoxication. In his belongings, police found a fragment of rock carved with what looked like tally marks, 30 in total. Reed insisted he had taken it from the mine that counts. He described an entrance hidden under shale, where voices whisper the names of men gone missing. The constable dismissed him as mad, but the stone fragment vanished from evidence before Reed's trial. As the new century turned, most who had known the Blackstone family were dead or moved away. The property, reclaimed by Forrest, slipped into legend. Yet for miners across West Virginia, its tale became a quiet caution, passed from father to son, "Never mine where the stone remembers." And when the Monongah disaster struck in 1907, killing hundreds, a few older men muttered that the same wind that had sealed Blackstone Hollow had finally exhaled again. By 1908, the Blackstone Hollow incident had all but faded from public record, yet among miners, it had become a quiet superstition, something spoken of only in the dim glow of oil lamps, when the tunnels creaked and the air turned sour. The story was passed down not through official channels, but in the half-whispered traditions of those who worked beneath the mountain. In one notebook preserved at the West Virginia Coal Heritage Museum, a miner named Henry Leach recorded an unsettling entry dated October 3, 1908. "Men talk of the hollow as if it's a mouth. They say every so often it opens to breathe, and when it does, those who died down there take roll call. Some swear they've heard their own names being counted." Leach was stationed near Ansted, almost 40 miles away, yet he described seeing a soft, low pulse of light beneath the ridge line on nights when storms rolled through. "It's not lightning," he wrote. "It's the mountain remembering its dead." That same year, a small expedition funded by a group of speculative investors attempted to reopen mining rights around the Elk Valley. They hired a local surveyor, Miss Abigail Norrell, one of the few women in her field at the time. Her surviving journal, found in an estate sale in 1923, contains detailed sketches of the terrain and the remnants of the old Blackstone site. On one page, written faintly in pencil, she added a personal note: "No birds, no growth. Soil feels warm. My compass spins even when I stand still." Norrell's notes end abruptly 2 days later. The last line, barely legible: "The ground hums louder at dusk." Her employers claimed she returned to Charleston safely, but no letter or further work from her has ever surfaced. Some say she left for Baltimore. Others claim she simply vanished, like so many who ventured near that ridge. Meanwhile, Thomas Blackstone, the man who started it all, remained an enigma. By 1900, he was presumed dead, yet in 1910 a census taker in Bluefield recorded a T. Blackstone, age 71, widowed, occupation none. The handwriting is uncertain, but the name appears again on a local lodging register for the same month. Witnesses remembered him as pale, quiet, and always watching the horizon. When asked where he came from, he reportedly said, "From under the hill." Not long after, he disappeared again, leaving behind only a small wooden box. Inside were geological maps, fragments of coal samples, and a faded photograph. 30 men standing before the mine entrance, their faces solemn, none smiling. The back of the photograph was inscribed in thin ink, "Taken the morning they went below." The box was passed between collectors for decades before ending up in the possession of a private researcher, Dr. Warren Laidlaw, who lectured briefly on mining anomalies at the University of Charleston. In his 1933 paper, Topographical Memory and Mineral Deformation in Coal Seams, Laidlaw referenced the Blackstone case, describing it as a unique intersection of geology, human frailty, and folklore. He theorized that what miners experienced as breathing rock could have been barometric inversion, trapped pockets of air expanding and contracting within sealed chambers. But even he admitted the data didn't fully align. For a mountain to move as described, he wrote, would require forces beyond those measured by any instrument of the age. In his later years, Laidlaw revisited the Blackstone Ridge. He described a palpable sense of weight in the air, as though the valley itself resisted intrusion. "It is," he wrote, "a silence that feels like pressure." He died in 1938. His notes were found scattered across his desk, and among them a final sketch, the shaft mouth, drawn as a closed eye. Today, nothing remains of the Blackstone house or the settlement around it. The forest reclaimed what man abandoned, and the road that once led to the site is barely more than a faint depression beneath the pines. Yet on certain nights, locals claim the ground still exhales a brief, metallic sigh that smells faintly of coal dust and rusted iron. And though a century has passed, the miners who descend into the hills still speak the old phrase, "When the lights flicker underground." Count once, not twice, lest the hollow answer back. By 1911, the Blackstone Hollow story had become a sort of ghost currency among the miners of southern West Virginia. The coal fields were booming again, rail lines extending deep into the ridges, and men came from everywhere, Scots, Poles, Italians, freedmen from the Carolinas, all chasing the promise of steady wages beneath the earth. But even the most desperate refused contracts that bordered the Elk Valley. The old-timers warned them quietly. That ground's been paid for in full. What few knew was that a handful of state engineers had quietly reopened the site that same year. Their task was not extraction but documentation. The newly formed West Virginia Geological and Economic Survey, inspired by earlier disasters like Monongah, sought to catalog abandoned mines across the state. Among their assignments was the Blackstone property, listed in correspondence as Hollow No. 47. The survey team consisted of 4 men and 1 stenographer. Their leader, engineer Franklin Hobb, was meticulous, recording every contour of the hillside and every irregularity in the stone. His surviving field book, preserved at the Morgantown Archives, includes an early entry, "Ground appears to have resettled. No formal shaft visible. Forest reclaiming upper slopes. However, barometer readings fluctuate sharply. Drop of 0.09 within 5 minutes. Suggests active void beneath surface." Later pages turn stranger. On June 4th, he wrote of hearing a rhythmic vibration, like hammer on hollow pipe, though none of his crew reported it. The stenographer, Miss Elsie Crane, noted in her transcript, "Mr. Hobb grows uneasy at sundown. He watches the soil as if it might move." That evening, a thunderstorm swept through the valley, flooding their camp. When the crew awoke, one of their men, Peter Madsen, a Dane recently hired from the Fairmont fields, was gone. His cot was empty, though his boots remained. They searched the forest for 2 days. Hobb finally wrote, "We will list him as lost to the terrain." That phrase would later appear again in state documents concerning other disappearances, becoming a bureaucratic euphemism for swallowed by the earth. When Hobb's group returned to Charleston, only 4 of the 5 signed their report. The missing man's signature line was left blank. Within months, the department reclassified the site as unstable, ineligible for redevelopment. The file was marked closed. Hobb never worked in the field again. Years later, his widow donated his papers to the Geological Survey, including one unfiled note dated July 11, 1911. "Each night, the air grows warmer near the old shaft. Not wind but breath. The same breath those men took before the mountain learned their names." That phrase, "the mountain learned their names," would become part of regional folklore. Children in Kanawha and Fayette counties repeated it as a dare, claiming that if you shouted your name into the hills after dark, you'd hear it whispered back. Sometimes, they said, it wasn't your own voice that answered. The Blackstone property changed hands several times over the next decade. A timber company tried to log the ridge, but abandoned it after equipment failed repeatedly. A prospector purchased the mineral rights in 1916, but vanished the following spring while surveying the site alone. His horse returned without him, reins torn. The sheriff who investigated found boot prints that led directly into a patch of disturbed soil, then stopped. It was like he stepped into air, the report read. By the 1920s, as West Virginia modernized and mechanized its mines, few remembered the name Blackstone. The Depression years buried the story further. Survival left little room for superstition. Yet among old miners who'd seen too much rock fall, too many comrades vanish beneath coal dust, the name still lingered, quietly, like an inherited scar. When asked about the hollow in 1929, one gray-haired foreman at the Monongah Works reportedly said, "You can dynamite a mountain, but you can't unteach it what it's learned." And that one remembers too much. The reporter struck the quote from his final article, noting only, "Old miner declines further comment." By 1919, after the First World War, the Appalachian coal region changed in tone and tempo. New machinery cut deeper, railways thundered with wartime freight, and thousands of returning soldiers took work in the mines, thinking steel nerves and steady hands could master any darkness. Yet the veterans who came through Kanawha County avoided one hollow. Maps still listed it faintly, Blackstone Ridge, but the roads leading there had eroded into narrow veins of moss and shale. One of those soldiers, Private Henry Daltrey, left behind a journal that surfaced in a Wheeling antique shop in the 1950s. In an entry dated November 8, 1919, Daltrey wrote that he'd gone hiking in the Elk Valley with two other men, looking for timber land. They found, he said, a clearing that hummed like an engine though nothing moved. Beneath the hum, a hollow depression in the soil gave off faint warmth. When they dug with a stick, black dust rose, like steam from a lung. He added, "I heard tapping underfoot. I counted 9 beats, then silence." Frank said it was echo from our own steps, but the ground counted wrong. It missed the 10th. Daltrey's 2 companions later confirmed the hike, though neither remembered the details as he wrote them. Frank Russell, when interviewed years later, said only, "There was a stillness that day you could feel in your teeth." At roughly the same time, the Charleston Geological Review published a short paper referencing anomalous magnetic fields detected in abandoned mine sites, including the Elk Valley region. The study, written by Dr. Harold Cutler, did not name Blackstone directly but described a series of sub-surface fluctuations behaving like respiration, expanding and contracting pockets of heat and gas. He suggested they could be remnants of old fires or trapped methane, yet admitted that the intervals appear rhythmically constant, almost mechanical. Locals found their own explanation. They said the mine still kept time with the lives it took. An old woman named Millie Grant, who sold bread near Cedar Creek, told a WPA interviewer in the 1930s, "That hollow was born hungry and stayed so. Every few years it sighs like it's remembering supper." By then, only fragments of the Blackstone family's existence remained. An entry in the county census, a few scattered mentions in tax records, and the fading photograph of the 30 men. Yet one new clue emerged that same year when a trunk was discovered in an abandoned boarding house near Beckley. Inside were receipts for mining supplies dated 1894, signed T. Blackstone, and a small ledger listing 30 names with notes beside them. Most rid paid, but 5 were marked owed. Next to the final entry, in smaller handwriting, was a single line. "The mountain keeps its own accounts." The trunk was acquired by a collector and later lost in a warehouse fire. Only a few charred pages survive, held today in a private archive. Historians have debated whether the ledger was genuine or part of the folklore that grew around the Blackstone name. But one consistent fact troubles researchers: the handwriting matches the same style as the 1872 immigration papers of Thomas Blackstone himself. Sometime in the early 1920s, a fire swept through the Elk Valley forests. Locals said it started during a dry lightning storm, yet rain fell heavily that night. Witnesses from the nearby town of Clendenin described seeing the flames burn downward instead of up, glowing through cracks in the soil like embers under glass. For 3 days, the fire smoldered without smoke. When it finally extinguished, the hollow was left black and featureless, as if freshly mined. The state surveyors returned to map the damage in 1923 but found no evidence of burn. Soil intact, the report reads. Vegetation lost without combustion. The entry was quietly filed under Unexplained Geological Occurrence No. 62. After that, the land was left alone. Locals built new roads, new mines, and new lives, but the old ridge remained untouched, an empty place on the map, like a page someone had erased too thoroughly. And if you asked why, the elders would answer with the same tight-lipped certainty, because it already took what it wanted. In the years following 1923, the Blackstone Hollow became less a place and more a caution, an unspoken reminder that not every vein of coal should be disturbed. The new generation of miners grew up hearing fragments of the story at supper tables and campfires. Some laughed it off as hill superstition. Others carried charms in their boots, just in case the mountain still listened. By 1926, renewed interest came not from miners but from Professor Lionel Harrow, a folklorist from the University of Virginia who traveled through Appalachia documenting ghost tales and oral histories. His notebooks, now housed in the American Folklife Center, contain one of the few surviving interviews with an aging witness to the original 1894 event. John Pruitt, the last living man known to have worked for Thomas Blackstone. Pruitt, then nearly 80, spoke to Harrow from his porch in Golly Bridge. His words, transcribed phonetically, carry the cadence of the mountains. Them that went down, they weren't no fools. We heard the earth change its tone that week. A deep hum like the hills themselves had got hollow lungs. Mr. Blackstone said to work quick before the cold set in. I said, "Sir, that air don't belong to us." He just stared, said it was too late to stop what was waking. When Harrow asked what he meant, Pruitt refused to elaborate. "I'm the last to say it out loud," he said. The rest went deeper. In a margin note, Harrow wrote, "Subject trembling. Repeats phrase deeper than meant to go 3 times before ending interview." Pruitt died within the year, and Harrow's research moved on, but the interview later became central to a short-lived academic debate in 1930 when the Charleston Gazette published excerpts of his notes. Letters poured in from locals insisting that the hollow was alive. One anonymous miner wrote, "You can't bury 30 men and expect silence. The ground learned to breathe around them." Another claimed that if you laid an ear to the soil near the ridge, you could still hear hammering, soft but steady, like work continuing on the other side. In that same period, the Monongah disaster, by then already a painful memory, was being re-examined in safety reports. One retired foreman drew parallels between the two tragedies, noting that the same strange metallic odor had preceded both events. "It's a smell of old heat," he said, "like coal burning where no flame shows." He called it the miner's omen. When pressed for examples, he cited Lost Shaft near Elk Valley. Though he never used the name, everyone understood. By 1932, the Great Depression had silenced many of the smaller mines entirely. Men walked away from towns built of sweat and stone, leaving them to the forest and rain. Yet the hollow stayed curiously preserved. Storms veered around it, and even wildfires seemed to skip its narrow basin. Those who passed nearby swore the trees grew in strange patterns, circling inward, as though bending toward something below. An article from the Beckley Post Herald that year told of a hiker who stumbled into the valley while hunting ginseng. He described a hollow so quiet my heartbeat felt like noise. He claimed he saw faint impressions in the dust. 30 shallow depressions, side by side, like footprints that had refused to fade. He ran before counting twice. When he later tried to find the place again, it was gone. The forest had closed over the path, leaving no sign that anyone had ever walked there. Professor Harrow's notes end with one haunting line. There are stories the earth remembers even when men forget, and in that valley, forgetting might be the only mercy. No expedition would attempt to enter the hollow again for nearly 20 years. But the ground, it seemed, never truly slept, only waited. The silence held through the 1940s, through the lean years of war and ration, through the hum of new industry and the slow fading of the old mining towns. By the end of the decade, few even remembered the name Blackstone. The company itself had long been dissolved, its charter revoked in 1902, and all physical assets sold to the Charleston Iron Cooperative. Yet some records, folded away in state archives, kept the family's trace alive in brittle ink. It was 1948 when the hollow stirred again, though not in a way anyone expected. That winter, a series of tremors rippled through Kanawha and Boone counties. They were minor, registering less than 4 on the scale, but the locals described them as different from the usual deep shifts of coal seams. It felt like something stretching. One farmer reported, not breaking. The tremors came at exact intervals, every 31 hours, for 8 days. State geologist Dr. Raymond Beck dispatched to measure the phenomenon, noted in his report. Rhythmic underground pulses, duration approximately 90 seconds, amplitude diminishing at each recurrence. Source undetermined, but acoustic properties reminiscent of a contained resonance rather than a tectonic event. Beck's assistant, a young surveyor named Lucy Ketter, made a private notation beside the official entry. The pattern corresponds roughly to human respiration. Inhale, pause, exhale. 31 hours apart. The source of the readings centered almost perfectly over the long, forgotten ridge once labeled Blackstone property, 1894. A month later, a snowstorm blanketed the region, and for the first time since anyone could recall, faint warmth rose from the frozen ground along the hollow's rim. When the snow melted, a miner's descendant, Earl Dunning, found fragments of wood and metal protruding from the soil. He brought one of the pieces, a rusted pickaxe head, to a local museum in Charleston. The curator cleaned it, revealing an engraving barely legible under the corrosion T. Blackstone and Sons, 1894. Earl swore he could still smell coal dust on it. Like it just came up, he said. Around the same time, a local teacher, Miss Clara Rowan, compiled a booklet of regional legends for her students. Among them was The Breath of the Hollow, a story she said came from her grandfather. It told of a mountain that borrowed breath from men, and of a family that fed the dark to keep the mine alive. She closed her notes with a small citation. See also, Monongah Mining Disaster, 1907 for similar reports of breathing mines. That brief academic aside drew interest from the West Virginia Historical Society, who asked Rowan for her sources. She admitted she'd heard it all from an old neighbor, who wouldn't say the name out loud, but traced the word Blackstone into the ash on his porch rail. When the society attempted to locate the hollow for survey, they found no direct path remaining. The road that once led there had collapsed into the creek, and a decade of brush had swallowed the markers. From the air, photographs showed nothing unusual, just undulating hills. But when the negatives were developed, technicians noticed faint lines forming a perfect ring of discoloration around one patch of forest, as though the trees themselves had arranged into a boundary. Dr. Beck, upon reviewing those aerial images, sent one final memorandum to the state office. I do not advise excavation. Some structures are better left to geology, not inquiry. He retired later that year, moved north, and refused to discuss the Blackstone case again. In local taverns, however, talk began to stir. Men who worked the new mines at Cabin Creek said their drills sometimes hit a strange layer of stone, slick, black, and warm to the touch. They called it the old seam, claiming it hummed faintly when struck, like something buried deep beneath that hadn't finished its work. The 1950s brought a new kind of curiosity to the hills, scientific, meticulous, and armed with instruments instead of shovels. With the rise of federal mapping projects and early seismographic studies, researchers began cataloging forgotten mine sites across Appalachia. Among them was Dr. Miriam Caldwell, a geophysicist contracted by the U.S. Bureau of Mines. Her task was to identify hazardous abandoned shafts, but her field notes reveal that one particular location, recorded only as Sector 14B, Elk Valley, haunted her findings. Caldwell's team arrived in late autumn of 1952. The weather was mild, though the valley air carried an odd metallic chill. The group set up seismographs, temperature gauges, and electromagnetic coils along the suspected rim of the hollow. On the first night, all readings were normal. On the second, an anomaly occurred exactly 2:17 a.m. Every instrument registered a sudden drop in temperature, 20 degrees in less than a minute, followed by a deep, resonant vibration that lasted precisely 90 seconds. The tremor had no measurable epicenter. It simply was, appearing on all charts simultaneously like the echo of something breathing beneath the earth. One technician, Paul Henley, later testified in a private memorandum, "The ground moved as if a huge diaphragm expanded under us. My boots lifted. Then the vibration ceased, and everything went still again." Caldwell recorded the event without comment, but in a later letter to her supervisor she wrote, "There is a rhythmic intelligence to this motion. It's not tectonic, not structural. It repeats in intervals, almost deliberate." When she returned to Washington with her data, the Bureau classified the file under non-actionable geological event and filed it away. 2 months later, Caldwell resigned from government work. Her colleagues said she grew reclusive, convinced she had measured something alive. That same winter, the Charleston Gazette ran a brief notice about an unexplained ground thaw near the Elk Valley Ridge. Locals found patches of steaming earth in the middle of the snow, perfect circles, each about 6 feet across, arranged in 2 neat rows of 15. Old-timers whispered it was the 30 men, warming their beds. The younger folks just shook their heads, but no one camped near that ridge afterward. The event drew renewed public interest in the old Blackstone legend. Reporters from the Wheeling Intelligencer revisited the archives, piecing together the 1894 accident that had supposedly claimed the miners. One journalist, James L. Marin, discovered something overlooked, a line in the county probate documents showing a land transfer in 1895 from Thomas Blackstone to Hiram Keene, a name not found anywhere else in the records. The signature, when compared with surviving samples, matched perfectly, but the handwriting on the date line was inverted, written backward as if seen in a mirror. Marin's article, published under the headline, "Did the Blackstone Mines Ever Close?" stirred brief controversy, then vanished under the weight of larger post-war news. Within a year, Marin himself had left journalism altogether. According to his wife, he began suffering from nighttime fits, waking to the sound of knocking under their floorboards. He insisted it was the same rhythm he'd heard described in Caldwell's report. 9 knocks, a pause, then one more. His final note, scribbled in a personal journal later found among his effects, read, "It isn't the men who were buried. It's what they uncovered." And it hasn't stopped counting. The handwriting trailed off mid-sentence. No one knows why. By the close of the decade, the hollow had been quietly removed from all state geological maps. Officially, the ridge was reclassified as an unstable subformation, a polite way of saying it was nobody's responsibility. Unofficially, locals began calling it the Silent Field. Hunters swore that when you crossed it, your rifle sights fogged and your voice wouldn't carry. Dogs refused to go in. And yet, every so often smoke, or something like it, still rose at dusk, curling through the trees in perfect symmetry, as though 30 lamps had been lit far below. By the early 1960s, Blackstone Hollow had slipped from most records, though the silence around it gave rise to something new, a strange allure among university researchers who sought to merge folklore and geology. In 1961, a small team from Marshall College, led by historian Dr. Ezra Hollings, undertook what would become the last documented attempt to physically reach the hollow. Hollings was a methodical man, more interested in data than superstition, but his letters from that expedition tell a different story, one of scientific inquiry slowly giving way to unease. The team left Charleston in late March. They followed old surveyor maps, many of which still bore the faint notation B.S. Ridge. 3 days in, Their vehicles could go no farther, so they continued on foot through thick laurel and shale. The deeper they went, the quieter it grew. By Hollings's fourth entry, dated March 26, the group reported that even insects seemed absent. He wrote, "Y are camped at the rim of the valley thought to contain the remains of the Blackstone mine. No birds, no running water. The compass drifts as if tugged by a pulse, not a magnet." That night, one of his students, Peter Lenz, described hearing a low rhythm under the ground, steady like a heartbeat. Hollings attributed it to distant mining machinery from Cabin Creek, though the nearest operation lay more than 12 miles away. The team noted the vibration lasted 1 minute and 30 seconds, matching exactly the duration recorded by Dr. Caldwell a decade earlier. On the morning of March 27, they descended into the hollow. Hollings's final field report survives in the Marshall Archives, its last pages brown from moisture. The handwriting, once confident, devolves into hurried scrawl. The terrain changes suddenly, soil black and warm, surface too regular, almost leveled. Found fragments of metal resembling rail spikes, each piece aligned north-south. Lenz collected samples despite warning not to disturb. Air pressure dropped rapidly, ears popped. Felt nausea, as if altitude shifted though elevation constant. After that, the record becomes fragmented, sound returning, faint tapping, repeating 9 times. Ground seems to breathe, can see dust rise and settle. Then one last legible line. "We are not standing on the mine, we are standing in it." When the group failed to return on schedule, local authorities organized a search. They found the camp abandoned but intact, supplies, maps, and equipment left in perfect order, the campfire still smoldering. Beyond it, a single trail of footprints led downhill and then stopped abruptly in the open clearing. No signs of struggle, no tools, no bodies. Only a faint circular indentation in the soil, roughly 30 feet across, warm to the touch despite freezing temperatures. 3 weeks later, one of the students, Peter Lenz, reappeared at a farmhouse 20 miles away. He was disoriented, dehydrated, and incapable of clear speech for several days. When he recovered, his memory was fragmented. He claimed he had walked out through noise, and that it took him 30 steps to reach silence. When asked what had happened to the others, he simply shook his head and whispered, "They went where the lights were." Lenz lived quietly afterward, never granting another interview. Decades later in the 1980s, a journalist revisiting his account discovered that his home was built from repurposed mining timber. Old beams marked with the faint brand T, Blackstone and Sons. When questioned, his widow said he'd salvaged them himself, to remind the ground it already had him once. After the disappearance of Hollings and his team, the state declared the hollow a restricted zone, citing unstable terrain. No further expeditions were permitted. The last notation in the official file reads simply, "Site subsumed. No recovery recommended." And for nearly a generation, that was the end of it. Until the day someone tried to build there again. The attempt to build on the old Blackstone land came in the summer of 1974. Coal had fallen from favor, and the hills were giving way to timber and gas leases. A company out of Wheeling, Appalachian Development Incorporated, purchased a tract of unclaimed acreage near Elk Valley for a proposed lumber mill. The deed traced back, ironically, through a clerical reassignment of the 1894 Blackstone property. No one at the time realized what ground they were about to disturb. Construction began on June 12. The crew consisted mostly of young men from Clendenin, paid weekly in cash. Their first few days passed without issue, until the surveyor, Roy Latham, noticed that their instruments refused to stay calibrated. Levels drifted, compasses spun, and the transit tripod shifted slightly every morning, though no wind or slope could explain it. Latham later told a local radio host that the ground itself moved like it was breathing, slow but steady, about once every hour. By the 3rd week, heavy equipment started to fail. Engine belts shredded without cause, drill bits dulled in minutes. One foreman described the soil as soft like ash but heavy as iron. When they tried to dig a foundation pit, steam rose from the earth, odorless, but warm enough to warp metal tools. The men joked it was the old mine exhaling. No one laughed long. Then came the accident. On July 3rd, an excavator operator named Tommy Griggs vanished in full daylight. According to eyewitnesses, he'd stepped down from his cab to mark a line in the dirt when the ground beneath him simply gave way. A sinkhole opened, no larger than a wagon's wheel at first, then widened into a perfect circle 6 feet across. Griggs's hard hat was later found at the edge, untouched, the brim warped from heat. Despite rescue efforts, no trace of him was recovered. The pit filled itself overnight, leaving only a smooth depression of blackened soil. Within 2 days, every worker refused to return. The company sent in a geotechnical consultant, Dr. Walter Crane, to assess liability. His report, now part of the State Safety Archives, described abnormal subterranean cavities exhibiting rhythmic contraction consistent with negative air pressure cycles. In simpler words, the ground was inhaling. Crane recommended the project be abandoned immediately. Appalachian Development ignored him for a month, then quietly sold the property back to the state at a loss. Officially, the incident was logged as subsurface gas activity. Unofficially, those who worked the site began reporting dreams. 30 men in a line, their lamps burning underground. A local preacher, Reverend Amos Dyer, claimed to have been called to bless the land afterward. In his journal, he wrote, "I laid my hand upon that soil and felt it rise beneath me, as though 100 lungs drew breath at once. I told the deputy who stood there, this ground remembers its dead. Best to leave it be." Within weeks, rain flooded the valley, and the access road washed away, making the hollow unreachable again. The company office that managed the sale burned down the following spring. An electrical fault, according to the report. Nearly all documents relating to the development were lost in that fire. Only one photograph remains. A faded aerial image showing a dark patch of earth. Circular, too perfect to be natural. If you look closely, 30 lighter shapes seem to radiate outward from the center, as if marking where men once stood shoulder to shoulder. The archivist who filed it added a faint pencil note on the back. Resembles early daguerreotype from 1894, Blackstone family site, compare patterns. The resemblance was never publicly acknowledged. But those who saw both images said they were identical, taken 60 years apart, and yet showing the same 30 marks, unchanged by time. By the end of the 1970s, the Blackstone property had once again fallen silent, fenced off by the state and labeled a restricted ecological zone. Few questioned why. The sign on the access road simply read Danger Us Logaronadud. But silence has a way of drawing the curious, and in 1978, a small group of amateur historians from Charleston, 3 men and 1 woman, set out to find what the state preferred to forget. Their leader was Elliot Warren, a schoolteacher fascinated by the region's lost mining families. He'd read about the Blackstone case in an old issue of the Wheeling Intelligencer and convinced his colleagues to accompany him on what he called a heritage hike. They carried cameras, notebooks, and a single outdated geological map that still bore the name Blackstone Ridge. They were last seen leaving their cars at a service road near Cabin Creek on the morning of October 19th. That evening, residents of Clendenin reported hearing what sounded like distant thunder rolling from the hills. Steady, low, rhythmic. Some said it was too measured to be storm noise. One old miner, Earl Pritchard, swore it matched the old breathing pattern, described in the Caldwell Report from 1952. He said, "It wasn't thunder. It was the mine sighing again." The hikers did not return that night. 2 days later, a search party found their campsite abandoned, but intact. Their personal effects, tents, lanterns, even a small tape recorder, were neatly arranged near a half-burned fire. On the recorder, investigators found a single spool of magnetic tape. When played, it contained 42 seconds of faint wind, followed by what experts described as metallic tapping, uniform in spacing, 9 beats, pause, then 1, then silence. That recording remains in the custody of the West Virginia State Police Archives. It has never been released publicly, though transcripts confirm that one of the voices on the tape, likely Warren's, can be heard whispering near the end. "We've found the old rails still warm." No trace of the group was ever recovered. Their cars remained at the road's edge for months before being towed. The incident briefly appeared in the Charleston Daily Mail under the headline, "4 Missing in Elk Valley Expedition." It was overshadowed the next day by national news and quietly forgotten. Within a year, all newspaper clippings relating to the case were missing from public archives. In the following decade, the land changed hands again. The state sold a portion of it to a private forestry trust in 1983, but every attempt at tree planting failed. Saplings wilted within weeks, their roots found blackened and brittle. Soil analysis showed traces of sulfur and high magnetite content, abnormal for the region. One lab technician, noting the pattern of decay, remarked it looked less like dying and more like something drew the life out from beneath. That same year, a photographer named Daniel Pike, freelancing for a regional magazine, captured what remains one of the most unsettling modern images of the hollow. Shooting at dawn, he aimed his lens across the valley and took a long exposure shot. When developed, the photograph showed faint, uniform lights deep below the surface, 30 pinpoints forming a symmetrical pattern. Pike assumed it was an optical flaw until he checked his exposure sheet. The camera had been covered during that frame. He never returned to the site. Months later, Pike mailed the negative to a Charleston museum with a short note. "Tell them the lamps are still burning." It was never published. The curator filed it under anonymous deposit, Blackstone Region 1983, and the envelope has remained unopened since. By the early 1990s, the hollow had become a place spoken of in careful tones, a geographical ghost, existing on no modern map yet stubbornly remembered in local rumor. But soon, another generation would stumble upon it again entirely by accident, and this time their discovery would not be so easily hidden. It was the spring of 1991 when the Blackstone Hollow surfaced again, this time not in any official record, but in the whispered accounts of hikers and surveyors. That year, the Kanawha County Land Restoration Project began recharting unused forest tracks to open public trails. One of the assigned teams, led by engineer Mark Fielding, was sent into a heavily wooded zone labeled simply Parcel 19. None of them knew the ground they were stepping onto had been the old Blackstone property. The group recorded their trek in routine detail for the first 2 days: temperatures, elevations, soil quality. Then, on April 9th, the log entries changed tone. A technician, Sarah Meeks, wrote that their compasses spun without friction, and their GPS units, early models then, froze on coordinates that didn't correspond to any known grid. The readings hovered between values, as if the devices were caught between points. On April 10th, Fielding made a note, standing at center of Valley Basin. No birds, static in the radio. Ground unusually warm to touch, black dust visible even under grass cover. That evening, the crew camped near what they believed was the rim of an ancient mine depression. The next entry, recorded at 2:46 a.m., reads thigh. Heard rhythmic tremor again. Duration 1 minute 30 seconds. Entire tent vibrated, no surface shift. Feels alive. The following morning, a large section of their surveying cable had melted into the soil, fused to the rock as if exposed to intense but localized heat. The event ended the expedition early. Fielding returned to Charleston to report the anomaly and request new equipment. His supervisor dismissed the story as instrumentation failure. Yet a month later, Sarah Meeks mailed copies of their field notes to a local historian, Professor Raymond Kerr, known for his work on West Virginia mining disasters. Kerr recognized the coordinates immediately. They fell within the same range marked on an 1894 mining map as Blackstone Ridge. Alarmed, he cross-referenced the notes with archival records, including Caldwell's 1952 report and the 1948 tremor logs. The intervals matched perfectly. 31-hour gaps, 90-second pulses. Kerr wrote to the Bureau of Mines requesting access to restricted survey data. He received a polite but firm denial. 2 weeks later, he was found dead in his office. Official cause: heart failure. But the building janitor later told a journalist that when he found Kerr, the floor beneath his chair was warm enough to steam through the carpet. The file folders stacked beside him had been blackened at the edges, though the rest of the office was untouched. The incident never reached public news, but among faculty at Marshall and WVU, whispers spread. Kerr had found proof that the hollow still moved. That same summer, hikers reported new sinkholes near Elk Valley, each circular, shallow, and perfectly symmetrical. The state closed the area once more, citing soil instability. A notice appeared briefly on a regional bulletin board for contractors. Do not disturb historical mining property. Geothermal hazard. But the wording changed 3 days later. The phrase, geothermal, replaced with gas pocket, as though someone had deliberately softened the description. Locals, of course, weren't fooled. To them, it was just the same story repeating, the ground taking back attention it didn't ask for. One elderly resident, when interviewed by a small Charleston paper that autumn, said quietly, "That mountain has its own memory. It keeps count. Every time they come poking around, it adds another number. And if you added up all the vanishings, the miners, the researchers, the hikers, the total stood at 63. Twice the number that never came back in 1894. Evening fogs began to cling longer in the valley that year. Campers who strayed too near claimed the mist glowed faintly from below, pulsing in time with the hush of the wind. No one could say why the glow always came in 30s. In the years that followed, the Blackstone hollow slipped again into silence, as if the mountain itself grew tired of witnesses. By 1993, the area had been fenced off under the name Restricted Geophysical Zone C19 Douane. The label meant little to most locals. It was the same phrase used for abandoned dynamite quarries and unstable slopes across the Appalachian chain. But for those who remembered the Blackstone story, it carried a darker weight. Among them was Reverend Amos Dooley, an elderly preacher from Cabin Creek, who claimed that his father had once been a boy working in the Blackstone mine camp. In an interview for the Charleston Gazette, Dooley said something few noticed at the time. "They say it was the mine that went bad. But my pa said it was the family. Said they dug into something that was older than iron and older than words." He refused to elaborate, citing, "An oath my father made in the smoke of the last fire." Those were his final public words. Dooley passed away the next spring. When archivists from the Gazette cleared his home, they found a thin envelope marked, "B. Hollow. Return." Inside were 4 fragments of paper, handwritten copies of what appeared to be an original journal, signed T. Blackstone, 1894. The handwriting matched period samples held in the Kanawha County records. The fragments read like private confessions rather than mining logs. There is a pulse beneath the 8th shaft. It answers to the pickaxe, as if it knows the rhythm of our labor. The men complain of a pressure in the skull, a humming. They think it is gas. I think it is memory. No one believes me that the rock bleeds black and hot, as if it resents being split. If the mine closes, it will close us with it. Dooley's copy of these pages was sent to the West Virginia State Archives in 1995, where it remains uncatalogued in a box labeled Unverified Testimonies. The archivist on duty that year, Martha G. Bell, left a brief note. Ink samples appear carbon-heavy, consistent with soot rather than pen pigment. Possible contamination from sample source. Still, the content of those fragments aligned disturbingly well with other records from 1894, particularly the Bureau's brief mention of subsidence accompanied by black vapor emission. No other West Virginia mine at that time recorded such a detail. Even in the broader context of the Monongah region's disasters, it stood out for its strangeness. Bell's note, though clinical, carried an unspoken weight. The ink itself had come from the mine's residue, meaning, if the journal were genuine, it had been written with the same black dust that once choked the air around the Blackstone pit. That autumn, a small group of amateur historians, styling themselves the Appalachian Record Society, hiked to the fenced perimeter of Zone C19. One member, Eli Carter, brought an old magnetometer used in archaeological surveys. His notes from October 17th describe a faint rhythmic fluctuation in magnetic readings, 30 beats per minute, emanating from below the center of the hollow. The number haunted him, 30, always 30, like the miners who vanished. Carter returned twice more in the following year, each time recording the same pattern, On his final trip in 1996, he reported the readings had doubled in intensity. He never filed a fourth report. His family claimed he'd moved to Ohio. The society's remaining members quietly disbanded soon after. Within a decade, vegetation swallowed the last traces of the old boundary fence. The state's mapping division removed the parcel designation entirely, merging it into the Elk Valley Forest Reserve. On paper, Blackstone Hollow no longer existed, but locals still used the name, passing it like a warning between generations. Never to cut trees there, never to dig. Even now, the land resists closure. Survey drones sent in 2010 recorded inexplicable interference. Their cameras flickered, sensors glitched, footage corrupted at 30-second intervals. It's as if the past still insists on marking its own rhythm, counting its losses, one pulse for every life that entered and never left. By the early 2000s, the Blackstone Hollow had become less a place than a rumor shaped by static and smoke. Maps omitted it. Locals stopped naming it outright, referring instead to the ridge that hums. When roads were paved closer to Elk Valley, workers found their equipment failing for no apparent reason. Battery drain, compasses misaligning, fuel gauges spinning wildly. Each time, state engineers chalked it up to magnetic minerals in the soil, yet no formal geological survey ever confirmed such deposits existed. Then in 2003, an independent film crew from Ohio traveled to the area to record a short documentary on forgotten mining settlements. Their producer, Lydia Trent, had found a reference to the Blackstone family in an out-of-print booklet titled Appalachian Calamities and Curious Losses. Printed in 1938, she was drawn to the mention of 30 unburied souls beneath a ridge of black ash. It was meant to be a 2-day shoot. They arrived on April 29th. The footage from the first day survives. A sunlit forest, slow pans of moss-covered timbers, the remnants of a mine entrance half swallowed by ferns. A crew member jokes about finding ghosts with pickaxes. The mood is casual, curious. The second day's footage is different. The light dims abruptly halfway through the reel, as if the camera lens had been covered in soot. Voices grow muffled, distorted by static. At the 23-minute mark, someone shouts, "It's moving again!" And the camera shakes violently before cutting to black. That was the final frame ever recovered. The crew's van was found 2 days later near Cabin Creek, doors open, equipment intact. But no sign of the 5 people who'd used it. The story briefly made regional headlines under the headline, "Filmmakers Lost in Elk Valley." Officials organized a search, deploying drones and canine units. Nothing was found beyond a single tripod sunk halfway into soft earth, the metal warped as though by heat. The footage was returned to Trent's family, who later donated it to the West Virginia Cultural Center, where it remains in storage. Archivists attempting to digitize it report that playback often causes nearby electronics to fail. Some devices refuse to power on afterward. A year later, a mining historian named Professor Ellen Avery gave a quiet lecture at the University of Charleston on the persistence of industrial folklore. She used the Blackstone narrative as her centerpiece, comparing it to other documented cases like the Monongah disaster of 1907, where hundreds of miners perished in an explosion still debated by experts. Avery argued that such stories served as a kind of cultural scar, reminders of the invisible cost of progress. But in the final minutes of her talk, she went off script, lowering her voices. "I don't think the Blackstone Hollow was a myth. I think it was an unfinished negotiation between men and the ground they tried to command." When asked afterward what she meant, Avery refused to elaborate. 6 months later, she left the university to work for the Department of Energy in an unspecified, site documentation role. She stopped responding to correspondence soon after. The mine's story seemed to dissolve with her silence. Newspapers no longer printed updates, and West Virginia's Mining Bureau removed all digital references to the Blackstone site, claiming clerical correction. By 2008, any search for the name returned nothing. It was as though the hollow had been excised from both land and memory. Yet people still claim to hear it. Campers along Elk Creek say the soil vibrates faintly underfoot at night, always in a slow, repeating pattern, 30 beats A pause, then silence. Locals call it the counting rhythm. They don't linger to listen. It might have ended there, forgotten, erased by paperwork and overgrowth, had it not been for a quiet discovery in 2012. A forestry intern named Hannah Locke, surveying tree health near the Elk Valley Reserve, came across a square stone embedded in the soil, half hidden beneath ivy. She thought it was a grave marker, but closer inspection showed it was carved with industrial precision. Edges straight, letters burned rather than etched. The inscription read, Black Stone, no 3sis FT CLD 1894-30 Registirati. The wording puzzled her. Registered implied a record, a ledger of those lost. Yet no such list had ever surfaced in the archives. Locke photographed the stone and reported it to her supervisor. When she returned 2 days later with a small team, the stone was gone, its place marked only by a shallow depression filled with fine black dust. Her photograph, however, remained. When examined digitally, faint background shapes appeared, dark, vertical lines, like silhouettes of men standing at a distance, their outlines blurred by motion. The forensic lab that analyzed the image dismissed it as artifacting caused by low light and lens refraction. Still, Locke resigned from the survey program the following week, later telling a friend, "I don't want to feel that ground again." That photograph reignited interest among regional historians. One of them, Dr. Samuel Pritchard, wrote a brief article for the Appalachian Historical Review titled, "The Lost Shafts of Blackstone Ridge." Pritchard compared Locke's find with century-old mine maps and concluded that, no, 3 shaft would have sat directly over the deepest tunnel, the one suspected to have collapsed in 1894. His paper was scholarly, cautious, but in the final paragraph he allowed himself a moment of speculation. If shaft no, 3 was sealed deliberately rather than by accident. The Blackstone family may have buried something other than coal, something they wished never to surface again. Pritchard's article circulated quietly in academic circles, then disappeared behind a paywall. 3 months later, his university suffered a small fire in its geology archive. The flames were contained, but the Blackstone documents were among the few materials lost. The fire marshal's report listed the cause as localized electrical surge. The server storing Pritchard's paper was also corrupted beyond recovery. By 2015, locals began to notice that new plant life refused to grow where the old mine entrances had once been. Saplings would sprout, then wilt within weeks, their roots coated in a slick residue like graphite. Hunters avoided the area entirely, saying their dogs grew restless when nearing the ridge. "They start whining," said one man in a 2016 interview. Like they're hearing something deep down. Occasionally, faint mechanical noises echoed across the valley at night. Metallic clanks, soft rhythmic strikes, then quiet again. Those who heard it said it sounded not like construction, but continuation, as though the mining never truly stopped. The tempo was always the same, 30 beats, then stillness. By that point, the Hollows story had evolved into folklore, retold in diner corners and mining towns as a warning to anyone who tried to take too much from the ground. It wasn't about ghosts anymore, it was about the earth remembering debt. A local teacher, when interviewed for a centennial piece on West Virginia's mining heritage, said something that echoed those old journals. "The mountain's not haunted. It's just unfinished." And maybe that's the truest way to describe the Blackstone legacy. Not a haunting, but a continuation. The same slow pulse that miners once mistook for the sound of steam or collapsing earth. A rhythm the ground keeps repeating, counting in silence, never forgetting. Today, the Blackstone Hollow exists mostly as a shaded absence on the map, a blank stretch of woodland between marked ridges, unnamed and unvisited. Yet, when the wind rolls through Elk Valley on quiet autumn nights, the locals say you can still hear a faint tremor beneath the soil, like someone tapping from far below. It's slow, measured, and always in 30s. The last documented approach to the site came in 2019, when a pair of graduate students from Morgantown, Elias Crane and Margaret Rowe, set out to create a digital topography of lost industrial settlements. They weren't ghost hunters or thrill seekers. Their goal was simply to reconstruct vanished landscapes for archival use. Their drone captured 15 minutes of footage before losing signal. The final frames, later recovered from the onboard card, showed a smooth depression in the ground roughly 60 feet across. At its center, the soil shimmered faintly, as though breathing. The university's lab concluded it was thermal distortion. But Crane noted something strange in his log. Distortion repeats in sequence, 30 pulses, pause, repeat, like a mechanical rhythm. That was the last entry in his notebook. Both students vanished 3 days later on their return drive through Fayette County. Their car was found neatly parked at a rest stop near the Gauley Bridge, doors locked, keys inside. There were no signs of struggle, only a thin layer of fine black dust coating the dashboard. The file remains open in county records, though seldom mentioned. If there's one constant through all these retellings, the miners of 1894, the search parties, the surveyors, the archivists, it's the pattern. The number that refuses to change. 30 miners went down. 30 beats beneath the ground. 30 pulses of static in each corrupted tape. It's as though the land keeps counting, marking each attempt to disturb its rest. Scholars who review the few surviving documents from the Monongah disaster sometimes cite the Blackstone case, in passing, as a cautionary tale of incomplete record keeping, a reminder that the early coal years were full of unmarked tragedies. But in local memory, the two are inseparable. Both spoke of explosions with no fire, of ground that moved without cause, of air that turned heavy without warning. The Monongah papers describe miners vanishing into dust, a phrase that mirrors testimony from the Blackstone clerks decades earlier. Some folklorists believe the Blackstone Hollow became a kind of echo chamber for all Appalachian loss, absorbing every story of collapsed shafts and missing men until it blurred fact and myth. Others, more quietly, suggest that the family themselves, Thomas, Ruth, and their sons, never perished at all, but were buried within their own creation, sealed inside a system that continued to breathe beneath them. Old residents of Cabin Creek say that, on certain nights when mist crawls through the valley, lantern-shaped glows drift in a straight line from the hollow toward the Elk River, like miners still tracing the old path home. No sound accompanies them, no pick, no voice, just the faint rhythm underfoot. Those who've stayed long enough to count say it stops at 30. Then the woods fall silent. Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling ever noted in West Virginia. Before we close it, remember the question that's haunted the region for over a century. Why did 30 miners never return? Some say the mountain kept them. Others believe they became part of it, pressed into its heartbeat, forever repeating the measure of their labor. And if you ever find yourself walking through Elk Valley, far from the sound of trains or roads, pause for a moment and listen to the soil. If the air seems to thrum beneath your boots, count the rhythm carefully. If it reaches 30, turn back. Because in West Virginia, some debts are still being tallied in the dark.